I feel like language is one of those things that's so personal and intimate to a culture, and that's kind of one of the things that continues to keep it going and kind of is what connects the community. And I feel like just having outsiders kind of picking it up and learning it and then just kind of speaking it is feels very, I guess, in some ways like tainted or like pretty much it takes away some of the like sacredness of the language. So the next one is, what stereotypes have people attributed to your culture? Yeah. So, one of the things that I try to emphasize is that Native Americans within themselves are very diverse. We're a very, very diverse group of people. I know again, like at Drexel, my student group, everybody assumes that because we're Drexel Indigenous students of the Americas, that any one of the students who are in the organization can speak on any culture that any Indigenous culture, and that's definitely something that I've had an issue with quite quite often. People expect me to like know all this different information about like all Native American tribes, the history of every single tribe, the culture, the language, and the most I tell what I tell them is the most I can speak on is being Navajo. That's what I grew up with. That's my culture, my tradition. I can't speak about the Lenape because I'm not Lenape. I may know some facts. I may have some friends or people that I've talked to and learned some things from, but it's not my place to speak for them. I can speak about them and kind of represent, do my best to represent what I know about them, but I can't say like, oh yeah, I know everything about the Lenape people. Um, One of the events I had like last week was thanks to the LAN event where we brought a Lenape speaker on, and he spoke kind of about his story, and it was very surprising. And I told everybody, I said, I came out of this event learning a lot. Sure, I know what our historical traumas are, but I didn't know what the Lenapes were. There were a lot of similarities, but we're different people, and even at some point these similarities end. Um, I think kind of going about that, specifically like stereotypes that I face, people just assume like, oh, you're Native American, so tell me about like I don't know. They usually default or like okay, no. One of the stereotypes is like when people ask, "Are you Native American?" For some reason, there's always this idea of like, "Oh yeah, are you one of those who's like, oh, I'm 1/14th, I'm one whatever. My grandma was a Cherokee princess." Like sometimes people automatically assume that I'm just saying I'm Native American, and they won't really like they don't people who don't know anything about me, they'll just come to that assumption. And I'm like, no, I grew up on the reservation. I'm full-blooded Native American, Navajo. Um, what else do you want me to say? Um, but one of the things is like, even though they're stereotypes, sometimes these stereotypes are in a ways kind of true, and that's one of the things I've had to kind of like struggle with as well, because like I don't know if you guys are familiar with, but there's this one show, I think it's on Hulu, that came out called Reservation Dogs, and I've gotten a lot of questions on it, and like people are saying like, how is that? Is Reservation Dogs like, is it accurate? Is it, what are your thoughts on it? And I've watched a few episodes when I went home for break, and we found it funny. We found a lot of different things that we could relate to, and the danger with that again was they were really feeding into stereotypes, but some of these stereotypes did hold some truth. So like definitely like it's one of those things again where it's kind of like in a way there's some bad things, but in a way there's also it also holds a little truth. So that's kind of been one of the issues I've struggled with stereotypes is just trying to tell people like, no, this is not, no, we don't represent who everybody, but there are little things that are kind of true that you kind of understand in a way, just because of pop culture, but like not really. So that's kind of one of the struggles I faced with stereotypes.
So it's interesting 'cause I think what you said about Reservation Dog, I think that's like a huge barrier to a lot of shows, newer shows that are trying to highlight different cultures, is that they feed into stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
that you can't fully like say, oh, well, that doesn't apply. Like,
Yeah,
tricky.
that's the other thing too, because it's kind of like I don't know, like personally, I think that like it's weird because like when in terms of like Reservation Dogs, I'm kind of like only Native people should be able to watch that because we understand it, like we lived it kind of thing. Like sometimes I want to, but then at the same time, it's kind of a learning experience for everybody in a sense, in that sure there are some stereotypes, but then put that aside, you take away some of the humor, and it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of an accurate depiction of how it might be on the reservation, and it's just kind of like you still got to remember that it's kind of like a satire, and it's supposed to have like comedy tied to it. So like yeah, there's a lot of different like maybe a stereotype, but does hold some truth, and I feel like that's true for a lot of different things as well.
Do you think it's worth watching?
Oh yeah, I think it's worth watching. We find it hilarious at home. Like like a lot of it, we're like, yeah, no, that totally happened to me, or like, yeah, no, I've had that experience as well.
Because what I found, I never seen it before, but like I realized, I guess it depends on what sort of, what level of self awareness you have going to this sort of thing too. Because the shows I have watched are about different kinds of families that I found more similarities than I was aware of.
Yeah, so I think the great thing about reservation dogs, is that some of the people who are helping to produce the series are like Native American. They grew up like on reservations, so they definitely do like portray things like as accurate as they can. Um, I kind of just lost where I was going. Let me think. I gotta think. Yeah, no, it's gone.
And to be fair, I'm literally just talking at this point.
Did your parents teach you anything about how you'll be perceived by the rest of the country? So, growing up, I grew up on the West Coast, primarily on the reservation, but we did have a few periods where we moved off and kind of like lived not on a reservation. So I did some schooling like in Washington State. I did some schooling in Utah and California, like very very elementary school as I was growing up. Um, and it just kind of that experience because my dad's a welder. He travels a lot, so at one point my family just kind of followed him to job to job to job, like moving every few months. Um, and that experience, kind of I think that experience prepared me a lot for what I was gonna face coming out off the reservation after I finished high school. Um, but definitely the West Coast is a lot different than the East Coast. I know growing up on the West Coast, there was always this idea of kind of like, yeah, Native Americans, there's a reservation like over here, there's a reservation there. Like there are people who are Native American. And that's one of the things I found that growing up I kind of enjoyed. Like when we lived in Washington, we would go to like Snoqualmie and like kind of see some of the history over there, or we would go to like the Yakima reservation because they have an IHS over there. So we would go over there sometimes, and like my mom and my dad, like they made friends over there. But then we went back to Arizona to the reservation there, and like I said, that's I was familiar with that. But then going from there to the East Coast, that was I think a culture shock. It wasn't a culture it wasn't a culture shock in the sense that like I'm off the reservation and like I'm in a city now. It wasn't that. I think the culture shock was just the stigma surrounding Native Americans. On the West Coast, it's kind of like, yeah, there's this presence, there's natives here. On the East Coast, it's just kind of like, natives? Weren't they taught to us like in elementary school, in like part of our history unit? And that's kind of one of the things I've found quite often talking to people. They grew up kind of like focused a lot more on American Revolution, like that type of history. Whereas I want to say on the West Coast, we focused a lot more kind of like on Western expansion, how this affected Native Americans, kind of seeing how colonialism, not necessarily colonialism, more like I said, Western expansion, and manifest destiny, how that affected these Native tribes. But then on the East Coast, it's just all U.S. history, that kind of thing. So, um, my parents, I think, prepared me the best way they could. Definitely, it was more, I guess, being prepared for the West Coast rather than being prepared for the East Coast. Especially coming to Drexel. Drexel had, at the time, when I first started my freshman year, I met with a woman who had access to a lot of the demographic information for the university. I just asked her like, oh, what is the Native American population on campus? Like, I'm curious. And she went through and she was like, oh yeah, for undergrads. And then like I could see her like going through. She's like, looks like there's about five to seven students who identify as a Native American, and that in itself was shocking. And to this day, my junior year, I've only met I think 2 or 3 other students. I have not even met the other 7 minus 4, the other 3 students. So definitely I feel like I was prepared in some ways, but then like I said, the whole culture shock with the Native American stigma, I wasn't prepared for that. I just wasn't prepared to have to continue to fight for a space here on campus, or like fight to be represented. And that's and kind of like be left alone, or kind of left in my own little corner without like all resources or community. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I think I faced coming here.
So, I'm a linguist myself. Navajo language is one of the languages I want to learn. It's on my list. It's high up there. Are you fluent in Navajo?
I would say I would say I'm a little more than like above intermediate by a lot, but not like quite fluent yet. I grew up with the language, but I can totally like when I hear it, I understand. It's just kind of speaking it every now and then is like a little bit challenging, or like I'll forget some words here and there. But overall, like I think I have a pretty good grasp of the language.
How do you feel about the present and the future of the language and other indigenous languages? Do you have an opinion on that?
I feel like the languages, or a lot of indigenous languages, it's going to be a challenge to keep them kind of to keep them going and kind of preserve them. I think it's kind of up to people to make that decision, that conscious decision, if they want to pursue it. I know for the Navajo language, it's very at this point it's very documented, and there's a lot of different resources, and there's a lot of natural speakers, and that's kind of one of the things that we have that a lot of people don't have. So I know the Lenape, for example, are one group of indigenous people who are trying to revitalize their language from like documents that from like U.S. history, documents and treaties that were signed then. They're trying to like backtrack and recreate the language. So that's definitely like one of the differences. And I see some languages continuing, but some of them, it'll be like a struggle.
Yeah, what is your take on them learning the languages?
I personally don't really support it or like it. I feel like language is one of those things that's so personal and intimate to a culture, and that's kind of one of the things that continues to keep it going, and kind of is what connects the community. And I feel like just having outsiders kind of picking it up and learning it and then just kind of speaking it, feels very, I guess, in some ways like tainted, or like pretty much it takes away some of the like sacredness of the language. Like I know Navajo is a very like regarded by our people very, very sacred, and like very like this powerful kind of language. And just sometimes like I'll meet people like, especially like, I'm not gonna lie, especially like some white people who like old white people who are trying to speak the language, and I'm like, maybe don't, please, maybe speak it, but like not in public. Like do that at home. That's kind of my opinion. Like I can't with people sometimes. Like it's, in a way, I feel like it's appropriating culture. Yeah, it's definitely, in some ways I feel like it's appropriating.
So like my statement about it being on my list of languages falls under that umbrella?
Kind of, yeah. Like as long as you don't claim to be as long as you don't claim it as like your own, or you try to kind of like own it in a way, or like brag like, oh yeah, I speak Navajo. I think that's one of the things that kind of throws me off, is like when I meet these white people who are like, yeah, I can speak the language too. And it's like, don't do it, please. But if like, there's no problem in learning it, and just kind of like, if you want to communicate with someone, but don't like treat it as your own, or like use it as like a way to brag, I guess. That's my opinion.
And also don't feel it needs a cushion it for me.
No, that's my like no, it's kind of like, in a way, like thinking about it too, like Spanish, that's not necessarily people's language, that's not necessarily like American either, but like definitely I think like to communicate, or like learn, like I guess maybe don't try to be fluent in it, maybe learn some phrases, like how to just like scrape the surface and kind of just baseline communicate. But like I wouldn't promote like, oh yeah, learn it and be fluent in it and like speak it all the time, that kind of thing.
This is totally not my video, but I just want to share something. I realized I never told you either how I learned Spanish. So I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. It was in high school. I went to like a small, like rural southern high school, and so like it was mostly white. But then also the secondary group was black, and there was like a huge sort of a lot of differences. I think people lump the South all into one sort of thing. Very very specific differences, and I guess stereotypes you assign to both, and people were very 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 bold about fitting within the stereotypes. They were okay with it, which is interesting. It's sort of different in the world we're living in right now. I didn't fit into either one of those for obvious like reasons. But the group I ended up fitting in with the most were like the Mexican students at the school, and so because they also didn't fit into either one of those, I had a close connection to them, and so that was sort of
I see.
how to, which is weird because I also like I've never identified as Latin, obviously because I'm not, but also have a whole separate connection to the language that's not even the same connection, but it is a connection. If that makes sense, because it's like it was a period of isolation that was a whole void feel, like a different sort of home. It's a sort of home feeling. It's not the same home feeling you would get from growing up in the culture, which makes it super tricky to explain to people, which is why I choose not to. I typically say nothing about it. But I thought about it just now, which is obviously not the same as what you were describing. But yeah, that's where that started.
No, that kind of brings me back to stereotypes. I think one of the very, very unique things about stereotypes that I face is that people never know what I am, or like they never have an idea, so they don't even know like how to treat me. Because when I was growing up and like when I would go to school like in Washington, people would always think I'm like Asian, or like specifically they would say I'm Chinese, like because that to them is what I came off as. But then I went to it was funny because then I went to my boarding school, which is probably like 95% Navajo, and everybody thought I was white just because like I'm a little bit lighter skin tone, I guess. So that was interesting. And then coming out here, people are like, "Are you Latino? Are you Chinese? Like Filipino?" So definitely, that's kind of one of the areas where like when it comes to stereotypes, I guess it hasn't bothered me too much, just because like all my life, people have been like not sure what I am. So I've never had to face like any direct stereotype or any direct like any type of treatment, just because like, oh yeah, we don't know what you are, so we don't know how to treat you. I feel like this is kind of like a little tangent, but like that's one of the things for me that I think is kind of an interesting experience.
Do you ever get tired of explaining to people your identity or your culture or just anything?
I think the like overall, I would say that I'm pretty happy to kind of talk about myself and kind of talk about my heritage and represent my people for the most part, just because it's kind of like when people think of Navajos or like Native Americans, they usually think of like poverty, low education, like all these different disparities. And I feel like when I talk about myself and kind of identify who I am in a way that's just kind of like defeating these different thoughts and ideas that people have, usually like when I meet people, I'll tell them kind of like, oh yeah, like I do this, I do this, I do this. And then after they hear about like some accomplishments, then I'm like, oh yeah, like somehow it'll happen. They'll be like, yeah, I'm Navajo, and then they're just kind of like, oh, and I'm like, yeah. So I I feel like I don't get tired of representing myself. The only times like I guess I get annoyed is when it's performative, like kind of like land acknowledgements are kind of like, oh yeah, like read this because can you say like a few words in Navajo? That's when it gets annoying, when it's kind of like, okay, like this is performative. But for the most part, I have fun and I enjoy just kind of talking about my people, where I'm from, and just kind of bringing that representation to the table.
Okay, pivoting. I'm gonna open this up to you. Say whatever you'd like to say as your final remarks.
I think one of the things, especially with kind of nearing the end of Native American Heritage Month, I just think it's funny how when the month comes up, that sure everybody's like interested in like, oh yeah, Native Americans are present, Native Americans are here, we need more representation. But then like as we go upon the rest of the year and into the new year, a lot of times like you were just forgotten again. And I think out of this month, one of the things that I've learned, and kind of one of the things that I've been stressing at all of these different events that I've attended, representing like Drexel Indigenous Students of the Americas, is like, don't forget us after November. And I think that's kind of the same for just in general Native Americans. Don't forget us after Indigenous Peoples Day, after Native American Heritage Month. And I think this is kind of one of, it's not necessarily like specifically for like this thing, but it's just kind of in general, like Native Americans are here, present, and they're always going to be present. And I think it's about time that the world begins to kind of acknowledge this a lot more. I know like some of the people I look up to are just paving the road. Like Deb Holland is one figure that I've just kind of like been following along her career path, and like one of these days like I'm gonna do something great like her. Or like Dr. Lori Alvord Arvizo, who's the first Navajo female general surgeon. Definitely just kind of like looking up to them and just seeing how much potential people have in my other Indigenous youth. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you for having me here.